The cuffs were too loose. That was the first mistake they made. I noticed it the moment 2 guards hauled me out of the holding bay and pushed me down a corridor built for creatures 3 times my size. The metal floor hummed under heavy footsteps that were not mine. My boots barely made a sound. Around me, the walls curved upward into shadows, lit by strips of pale green light that pulsed like a heartbeat. Everything about this ship was built to remind you that you were small. I let them think it was working. A voice crackled through a speaker somewhere above my head, deep and rolling, like rocks grinding against each other. Bring the creature forward. The Warlord wants to see it before the others arrive. The guards gripped my shoulders and shoved me through a set of doors that slid open with a low groan. The room beyond was massive, built like a hall meant for armies, not conversations. Banners hung from the ceiling, each one marked with the symbol of a world that no longer had a say in its own fate. At the far end, on a raised platform of black metal, sat Warlord Scarn Vex. He was enormous. Plated skin the color of dried blood covered his arms and shoulders, thick enough to turn aside most weapons. His eyes were narrow slits of yellow light, and when he looked at me, I felt the weight of every species he had ever conquered pressing down through that single stare. Around him stood his officers, silent and watchful, their hands resting near weapons they clearly expected they would not need. "So this is the creature my scouts captured," Scarn said, his voice filling the hall without effort. "The one drifting near our border, in a ship barely large enough to hold supplies for a week." I said nothing. I had learned a long time ago that silence made people nervous in a way that words never could. Scarn rose from his seat, each movement slow and deliberate, the kind of motion that came from a body that had never needed to hurry, because nothing had ever threatened it. He stepped down from the platform until he stood only a few feet away, towering over me, studying me the way someone studies an insect they found in their food. "Humans," he said, almost amused. "We have heard the stories. The newest species to stumble into the wider galaxy. Soft, slow, no claws, no plating, no venom. Your kind folded after a single skirmish with the Vayrens, did you not?" I kept my eyes on his. "Is that what you heard?" A low rumble came from his chest, something close to laughter. "It is what everyone has heard. Your fleet retreated. Your colonies surrendered border space without a single shot. The Vayrens called you cowards who learned quickly." He turned to his officers, gesturing toward me like I was a trophy already won. "I want this one kept alive. Put it somewhere the crew can see it. Let them understand what we are dealing with when the humans finally reach our territory. A frightened little animal that will run the moment it sees real strength." The officers chuckled, a dry, scraping sound that echoed off the high ceiling. One of them, a thinner alien with mottled gray skin and sharp ridges along his jaw, stepped closer to get a better look at me. His name, I would later learn, was Threll Ka, 3rd officer of the Hollow Maw, and a man who enjoyed cruelty the way some people enjoy a good meal. "It does not even struggle," Threll said, tilting his head. "Perhaps it already understands its place." I did not answer him either. While they talked, while they laughed, my eyes were moving, counting guards, marking exits, watching how the doors slid open and shut, noting the seam where the locking mechanism sat just behind the frame, cataloging the distance between where I stood and the corridor that led deeper into the ship. None of them noticed. Why would they? To them, I was already defeated. A curiosity, a lesson for their crew about how easily the newest species in the galaxy would break. Scarn returned to his seat, waving a clawed hand toward the guards. "Take it to the lower holding block. Let it sit with the others we have collected. Maybe it will learn some manners from creatures who already understand what defeat feels like." The guards pulled me back the way I came, through corridors that twisted and split like the inside of some great metal creature. I memorized every turn, every door, every guard post we passed, and how many soldiers stood at each one. I memorized the way the lighting changed from pale green to a dimmer amber as we moved toward the lower decks, a sign, I guessed, of older systems and less monitoring. We stopped in front of a thick door marked with symbols I did not recognize, though their meaning was obvious enough. A holding cell. The guards typed a code into a panel beside the frame, and the door slid open with a hiss of escaping air. "In," one of them grunted, shoving me forward. I stumbled into the cell, catching myself before I hit the floor, and turned just in time to watch the door seal shut behind me. Through a small viewport set into the metal, I could see the guards already walking away, laughing about something, not even bothering to post a watch outside my cell. Why would they? A soft little creature with no claws, no plating, nothing dangerous about it at all. The cell smelled like rust and old recycled air. Dim light came from a single strip along the ceiling, flickering every few seconds, like it had not been maintained in years. I was not alone. In the far corner, two other prisoners sat huddled together, their forms unfamiliar to me. Smaller than the crew above, but still nothing close to human in shape. One of them had pale blue skin stretched over a thin frame, large dark eyes blinking at me with something between fear and curiosity. The other was covered in soft fur the color of ash, with long fingers wrapped tightly around its own knees. "You are new," the blue-skinned one said quietly, its voice carrying a strange musical quality. "They brought you from the upper decks. We heard the guards talking." "That's right," I said, sitting down against the wall across from them, keeping my breathing steady and even. "You do not look afraid," the furred one added, tilting its head. "Everyone who comes through that door is afraid. The Warlord makes sure of it before he sends them down here." I almost laughed, though I kept it inside. I'm not exactly thrilled about the accommodations. The blue-skinned prisoner shifted closer, lowering its voice further, as if the walls themselves might be listening. "This ship has taken 11 worlds in the last cycle alone. 11. We are from one of them. They do not kill prisoners quickly. They keep us as proof of their strength, sometimes for years." I let that sit in the quiet for a moment, watching the flickering light trace patterns across the floor. 11 worlds. 11 flags hanging in that hall above us, each one a story of something taken that would never be given back. I thought about my own home, about the quiet certainty people there carried, the kind that came from knowing exactly what humanity had survived to get this far, and exactly what we were capable of when given no other choice. "Why are you so calm?" the furred prisoner asked, genuine confusion in its voice. "Your species is small, weak," the guards say. They laugh about it constantly. They say humans surrendered the moment real danger arrived. "They've heard one story," I said quietly, "and they think it's the whole book." Neither of them understood what I meant, and I did not explain further. Instead, I let my eyes drift toward the door, toward the faint outline of the locking mechanism visible even from across the cell. I thought about the corridor outside, about the turns and the guard posts, and the distance to the upper decks. I thought about Skarn, sitting on his throne, certain that he had already won, certain that nothing on this ship could possibly threaten him. Above us, through the thin walls, I could hear the muffled sounds of the crew going about their routines, footsteps, laughter, the occasional clang of metal against metal, as someone worked on a piece of equipment. It was the sound of a ship that had never once feared what might be sitting in its own holding cells. A ship that had grown comfortable, complacent, certain of its own strength because nothing had ever tested it. That certainty, I knew, was the most dangerous thing in this entire vessel. Far more dangerous than any weapon Skarn kept locked away in his armory. Confidence built on assumptions has a way of crumbling the moment those assumptions turn out to be wrong, and nobody on this ship, from the lowest guard to the Warlord himself, had any idea how wrong they actually were. I closed my eyes, not to sleep, but to think, to plan. Somewhere above me, footsteps echoed down a corridor I had already memorized, and a junior officer's voice drifted closer, full of the same lazy confidence that had filled this entire ship since the moment I arrived. He was coming to look at the curiosity in the cage. He had no idea what he was about to let out. The footsteps stopped outside the cell door, and I opened my eyes. Through the viewport, I could see him clearly now. A junior officer, younger than the others I had seen on the bridge, his plating not yet scarred by the kind of battles that left marks on the older crew. He carried himself with the particular swagger of someone who had never once been tested, someone who had grown up hearing stories of conquest and assumed that strength was simply something you were born with, rather than something you earned. "Is it true?" he asked one of the guards standing nearby, his voice carrying easily through the thin door. "The Warlord caught one of the new species, the humans?" "See for yourself," the guard answered, sounding bored. "It is sitting right there. Not much to look at." The officer stepped closer to the viewport, peering through with open curiosity. His eyes found mine, and for a moment neither of us said anything. I studied him the way I had studied everything else on this ship, the slight tremor in his hands that suggested nerves he was trying to hide, the way his weight shifted from foot to foot, untrained, uncertain, the fact that despite everything he had heard about my species, some small part of him was still cautious enough to keep his distance from the door. That caution would not last long. Confidence, once it takes root in a place like this, spreads quickly. "It looks harmless," he said finally, almost disappointed. "I expected something more frightening, given how much trouble the elders say your kind will eventually cause." "Disappointing, isn't it?" I said, keeping my voice calm and even. He blinked, clearly not expecting a response in his own language, though our universal translators had clearly done their work the moment I spoke. "You understand me." "I understand a lot of things," I said. The guard beside him laughed, a short, sharp bark of amusement. "It talks. How charming." I let the silence stretch after that, watching the young officer's curiosity grow the way I had hoped it would. Curiosity, when paired with overconfidence, was the most useful tool I had in this entire situation. I had no weapon, no allies among the crew, no way to force anything to happen. What I had was patience, and the certainty that every single person on this ship believed they had nothing to fear from me. That belief was a door, and doors, eventually, could always be opened. While I waited, my mind drifted back to training I had gone through years earlier, back when humanity was still learning what kind of galaxy it had stumbled into. I remembered an instructor named Henry Caldwell, standing in front of a room full of recruits, telling us something that stuck with me long after the lesson ended. "Every species you meet out there," he had said, pacing in front of a holographic display showing dozens of alien silhouettes, "has spent thousands of years building its strength around whatever advantages nature gave it. Claws, venom, armor plating thick enough to stop a blade. They have never needed anything else, because nothing ever forced them to develop anything else. We do not have those advantages. We never did. What we have is everything we built ourselves, out of necessity, across thousands of years of fighting for every single thing we ever had. That is not a weakness. That is the only reason any of us are sitting in this room today." I had not understood the full weight of those words back then. I understood it now, sitting in a cell built for creatures twice my size, surrounded by a crew who had already decided I was harmless before they had any real reason to believe it. The blue-skinned prisoner shifted beside me, drawing my attention back to the cell. "You are thinking about something," she said quietly. Her name, I had learned during the quiet hours we sat together, was Vile, and she had been a teacher on her homeworld before the Hollow Maw arrived, and ended that life entirely. "I can see it in your face." "Just remembering something someone told me a long time ago," I said. "Will it help you?" she asked, a flicker of something like hope crossing her features. "Is there a way out of here? We have tried, you understand. Others before you have tried. The ship is too large, the crew too numerous. Every escape attempt has ended the same way. Maybe those attempts were missing something," I said. "What?" "They were trying to be quiet," I said, watching the corridor through the viewport, watching the young officer linger a moment longer, before finally walking away with the guard, already growing bored with the curiosity in the cage. Sometimes the loudest thing you can do is exactly what nobody expects. Vale did not understand, and I did not explain further, because explaining required certainty I did not yet have. What I had instead was a growing picture of this ship, built piece by piece from everything I had observed since the moment I was captured. The corridor layout, the guard rotations, the locking mechanisms on every door I had passed, all built to the same design, all sharing the same weakness, if you understood exactly where to apply pressure, and exactly how much force the seals could actually withstand before giving way. Hours passed, though it was difficult to track time in a cell with no windows and only the irregular flicker of failing lights to mark the passage of anything. The furred prisoner, whose name was Doss, had fallen into an uneasy sleep in the corner, his breathing slow and even. Vale sat awake beside me, occasionally glancing toward the door whenever footsteps echoed down the corridor outside. "Tell me about your homeworld," she said eventually, breaking the long silence. "If we are going to sit here, I would rather talk about something other than this ship." I thought about how to answer that. about the cities built along coastlines that had survived storms and wars and everything else humanity had thrown at itself before finally turning its attention outward to the stars, about the long, difficult history that had shaped a species which never had the luxury of natural advantages, only the ones it built for itself through sheer stubbornness. "It's loud," I said finally. "Crowded. We've spent most of our history fighting each other before we ever had the chance to fight anything else. By the time we finally looked up at the stars, we had already survived worse than anything we expected to find out here." "Worse than this?" Vale asked, gesturing around at the cell, at the muffled sounds of the crew above. "Different," I said. "Not necessarily worse, just different enough that none of this feels as unfamiliar as Skarn probably thinks it should." She studied me for a long moment, her large dark eyes searching my face for something I was not sure she found. "You are not like the others I have shared this cell with," she said finally. "They were afraid. Some of them still are, even now, in whatever cell the guards moved them to. You are something else. I do not have a word for it. We just call it being human," I said, and left it at that. The lights flickered again, dimming briefly before stabilizing, and somewhere above us, the ship's engines hummed a fraction louder, a sign, I guessed, that the hollow maw was preparing for another jump through whatever stretch of space lay between here and wherever Skarn intended to take his newest curiosity next. I did not intend to be in this cell when that jump happened. I thought about Skarn sitting on his throne, certain of his own strength, certain that humanity was exactly what the rumors claimed. I thought about Threl Ka's sharp, mocking laughter in the hall above, and about the 11 banners hanging from the ceiling, each one a story of conquest that had never once been challenged. And I thought about the young officer, the nervous tremor in his hands, the way curiosity had pulled him closer to the cell door, despite every warning his training should have given him. He would be back. Soldiers who lacked real experience always returned to the things that fascinated them, especially when nobody else was watching and they had something to prove to themselves. When he did come back, he would make a mistake. Not a large one, just small enough that nobody would think to warn him about it, because nobody on this ship believed that mistake could possibly matter. I settled back against the cold metal wall, closed my eyes, and waited. Patience, I had learned a long time ago, was not the absence of action. It was simply action that had not yet been given its moment. The hours stretched on, marked only by the irregular flicker of the failing light strip and the distant hum of the ship moving through whatever void lay beyond its hull. Doss stirred occasionally in his sleep, mumbling words in a language the translator did not catch. Vale remained quiet beside me, lost in thoughts of her own, perhaps of the homeworld she had described only briefly, before falling silent again. I used the time to build a clearer picture in my mind, piece by piece, of everything I had seen since stepping aboard this ship. The throne room sat at the highest accessible deck, connected by a single main corridor that branched into smaller passages, leading toward crew quarters, storage, and the lower holding block where I currently sat. The guard rotations followed a predictable pattern, shift changes occurring at intervals that suggested a crew confident enough in their own dominance that they had never bothered tightening security beyond the basics. Every door I had passed shared the same locking mechanism, a simple magnetic seal, reinforced by a mechanical bolt, designed to withstand impact from weapons, not sustained pressure applied directly against the frame itself. It was a design built by a species that had never needed to consider what might happen if something without claws, without plating, without any of their natural advantages, decided to simply pull. Footsteps echoed down the corridor again, lighter than the heavy stride of the regular guards. I opened my eyes and watched through the viewport as the same young officer from earlier approached the cell once more, alone this time, no guard accompanying him. Curiosity, it seemed, had won out over caution entirely. He stopped in front of the door, glancing both directions down the empty corridor before stepping closer to the viewport. "Still here," he said quietly, more to himself than to me. "Where else would I be?" I said. He almost smiled at that, some of his earlier nervousness fading into something closer to genuine interest. "The others say, your species surrendered the moment things grew difficult, that you ran from a fight you could not win. People believe a lot of things," I said, "right up until they don't anymore." He studied me for a long moment, and I watched his hand drift toward the control panel beside the door, almost without him realizing it. drawn by simple curiosity, by the desire to see this strange creature up close, without the thick metal barrier between us. It was exactly the kind of small, careless mistake that confidence built without real experience tends to produce. His fingers hovered over the panel. I did not move. I did not speak. I simply waited, watching, every part of me coiled, and ready for the moment that overconfidence finally opened a door it should never have touched. The panel chirped, and the door released with a hiss of escaping air. He had not meant to open it. I could see that in his face the instant it happened, the sudden widening of his eyes, the way his hand jerked back from the control panel, as if it had burned him. A reflex, nothing more. Curiosity had carried his fingers closer than intended, and the panel, sensitive and poorly maintained like everything else on the lower decks of this ship, had registered the touch as a command. For half a second, neither of us moved. Then I was through the gap before the door had even finished sliding open, closing the distance between us faster than he had time to process. He opened his mouth, perhaps to call for help, perhaps simply out of shock, but I was already past him, one hand closing over his wrist and guiding him firmly into the cell I had just left. He stumbled backward, more startled than hurt, his back meeting the wall with a dull thud. "Stay quiet," I said, my voice low and even, "and nothing else happens to you tonight." He stared at me, breathing hard, clearly trying to understand how the situation had reversed itself so quickly. Behind me, Vale rose to her feet, her large eyes wide with something between disbelief and hope. Doss stirred from his sleep, blinking in confusion at the open door, and the young officer now pressed against the wall where I had been sitting only moments earlier. "What are you doing?" the officer managed finally, his voice cracking slightly. "Leaving," I said simply, already turning toward the open doorway. "You should have kept your distance." I stepped out into the corridor, the door sliding shut behind me with a soft hiss, sealing the young officer inside the very cell that had been built to hold something far more dangerous than him. The corridor stretched empty in both directions, dimly lit by the same flickering amber strips I had memorized hours earlier. I did not run. Running drew attention, drew eyes toward movement that did not belong. Instead, I walked with purpose, the same kind of confident, unhurried stride I had seen from every guard and officer aboard this ship since the moment I arrived. Vale's voice followed me through the closing gap of the cell door, soft and urgent. "Wait. Take us with you." I paused only long enough to glance back. "I will," I said, "but not yet. Moving through this ship with three of us is a problem I do not have a solution for yet. Moving alone, quickly, quietly, that I can manage. Trust me a little longer." I did not wait for her response. The door sealed fully shut, and I turned my attention back to the corridor ahead, walking toward the first junction I had memorized during my earlier march through this section of the ship. Every step brought a fresh wave of awareness, the careful counting of guard posts, the calculation of distances, the steady rhythm of a plan that had existed only in fragments until this exact moment, and was now, finally, beginning to take shape as something real. The first guard post sat just beyond the junction, a single soldier stationed beside a supply locker, more bored than alert, his attention focused on a small handheld device rather than the corridor he was supposed to be watching. I considered my options. A direct approach risked noise, risked alarm spreading faster than I could move. A quiet approach risked nothing at all, provided I understood exactly how much this ship's crew had come to rely on the assumption that nothing aboard their vessel could possibly threaten them. I chose quiet. The guard did not hear me until it was far too late to matter, and within moments, he was secured inside the same supply locker he had been standing beside, the door sealed shut, using the same magnetic locking system that had failed the young officer only minutes earlier. I took nothing from him except a moment of his attention and the knowledge that this section of the ship had just lost one more pair of eyes that might have noticed me passing through. The corridor beyond opened into a wider passage, the kind that connected multiple sections of the lower decks together. According to my memory of the route I had been marched through earlier, this passage led eventually toward the maintenance levels, a section of the ship I suspected would be less heavily guarded, populated mostly by automated systems and the occasional technician, rather than soldiers expecting trouble. I moved through it carefully, sticking close to the shadows cast by support beams and equipment racks. my footsteps deliberately measured to avoid the sharp echo that careless movement would create against the metal floor. Twice, I heard voices approaching from side passages and pressed myself into alcoves until the sound faded again. Crew members discussing routine matters, completely unaware of how close they had come to discovering something that would have changed the entire tone of their conversation. The deeper I moved into the ship, the more I began piecing together its true scale. This was not simply a warship. It was a small city built for conquest, with decks stretching far beyond what I had originally estimated, housing crew quarters, storage bays, weapon systems, and command structures all connected by a labyrinth of corridors that would have been impossible to navigate without the careful mental map I had been building since the moment I first stepped aboard. Eventually, I reached a junction that branched 3 directions, each marked with symbols I had begun to recognize from my earlier observations. One path led further down, toward what I guessed were the engine systems based on the increasing hum of machinery. Another curved upward, toward what I believed connected back to crew quarters near the throne room. The third stretched ahead level with my current position, toward a section the guards had referred to earlier as the maintenance block. I chose the third path. The maintenance block, when I reached it, proved exactly as quiet as I had hoped. Rows of equipment lined the walls, most of it automated, humming softly as it performed whatever routine functions kept this section of the ship operational. A single technician worked near the far end, focused entirely on a console display, completely unaware of my presence as I moved past behind a row of storage containers. It was here, surrounded by the quiet machinery of a ship built to project unstoppable strength, that I allowed myself a moment to actually think rather than simply react. I had escaped the cell. I had moved through several sections of the ship without raising any alarm. But escape, true escape, required more than simply avoiding detection within these walls. It required reaching something capable of getting me off this vessel entirely, or finding a way to disable enough of its systems that the crew would have no choice but to abandon their pursuit entirely. Neither option would be simple. Both required moving deeper into territory that grew increasingly dangerous the closer I came to it. I thought about Vale and Doss, still sitting in that cell, trusting that I would return for them despite having no real reason to believe I could deliver on that promise. I thought about the 11 banners hanging in the throne room above, each representing a world that had once believed, just as confidently as I needed to now, that resistance was simply not an option against a force this large. I thought about Skarn, sitting on his throne, utterly convinced that nothing aboard his own ship could possibly threaten him. He was about to learn exactly how wrong that conviction had been. A soft chime echoed from a nearby console, drawing my attention toward a display I had not noticed at first. Ship schematics, laid out in detail far beyond anything I could have pieced together through observation alone, showing every deck, every corridor, every system that kept the hollow maw functioning. The technician working nearby had left it active, too absorbed in whatever task occupied his attention to notice the opportunity sitting in plain sight. I moved closer, careful to stay low, studying the display with growing focus. There, marked clearly among the ship's systems, sat the security network, a web of doors and locks connecting every section of the vessel together, all of them sharing the same fundamental weakness I had already discovered in the holding block. Reinforced against weapons, reinforced against impact, never once designed with the assumption that something might simply pull them apart by hand. Somewhere above me, an alarm finally began to sound, distant at first, then growing louder as it spread through the ship's communication systems. The young officer, it seemed, had finally found a way to alert someone despite being sealed inside the cell, or perhaps the guard I had secured in the supply locker had been discovered sooner than I anticipated. Either way, the quiet phase of this escape had just come to an end. I looked back at the schematic display one final time, memorizing the layout of the corridors leading toward the bridge, toward the throne room where Skarn still believed his newest curiosity remained safely contained in a cell built for creatures far larger than myself. The alarm continued to rise, echoing through every level of the ship, and somewhere above me, I could already hear the sound of heavy footsteps beginning to move with purpose. Soldiers responding to a threat they still did not fully understand. I took one last look at the path ahead, drew in a steady breath, and started moving. If they wanted noise, I would give them noise. Every door between myself and that throne room was about to become a problem I intended to solve, the only way this ship's crew had never once prepared for. With my own 2 hands. The first reinforced door stood between the maintenance block and the corridor leading toward the upper decks, sealed tight the moment the alarm began sounding through the ship. I had expected this. Every section of the hollow maw was designed to compartmentalize quickly, sealing off potential threats behind barriers built to withstand sustained assault from weapons far more powerful than anything I carried. I did not carry a weapon. I had never needed one. I pressed my hands against the seam where the door met its frame, feeling for the slight gap that every door on this ship shared, a design flaw born from confidence rather than necessity. Nobody had ever needed to test these seals against something that simply refused to stop pulling. I dug my fingers into the gap, planted my feet against the frame, and pulled. The metal groaned, resisting at first, the magnetic seal fighting to hold its position against the sudden pressure. I adjusted my grip, found better leverage, and pulled again, harder this time, every muscle in my arms and back working together against a barrier that had never once considered the possibility of facing this kind of sustained, focused force. Something inside the frame cracked. I felt it before I heard it, a shift in resistance that told me the mechanical bolt, reinforcing the magnetic seal, had finally begun to give way. I pulled once more, and the door tore open with a final shriek of bending metal, wide enough for me to slip through into the corridor beyond. My hands ached, knuckles scraped raw from the rough edges of torn metal, but I did not slow down. Behind me, I could hear voices growing closer, soldiers responding to the alarm, their footsteps heavy and urgent against the metal floor. I moved forward, deeper into the ship, following the path I had memorized from the schematic display only minutes earlier. The next door came faster than the first, a smaller security checkpoint connecting 2 sections of crew quarters. 2 guards stood on the other side when it finally tore open, both of them frozen in shock at the sight of a door designed to withstand far greater threats, simply giving way beneath bare hands. I moved past them before either could fully process what they were seeing, leaving them stunned in the corridor behind me, their weapons still holstered, their training utterly unprepared for an opponent who solved problems by simply refusing to accept that any barrier was permanent. Word began spreading faster than I could move, voices calling out warnings over the ship's communication system, soldiers converging from multiple directions as the reality of the situation finally began sinking in among the crew. The creature from the lower holding block was not contained. It was not frightened. It was moving through their ship with a purpose that none of them had been prepared to face. I reached a wider junction where 4 soldiers stood waiting, weapons raised, clearly having been warned ahead of my arrival. I slowed, studying them for a brief moment, calculating distances and angles the same way I had calculated every other obstacle since stepping aboard this vessel. They were nervous. I could see it in the way their weapons trembled slightly, in the way their eyes kept darting toward each other, searching for reassurance that none of them could honestly provide. "Stop where you are," one of them called out, his voice carrying less authority than he likely intended. I did not stop. I moved toward the nearest support column instead, using it for cover as the first shots rang out, bolts of energy scorching the metal where I had been standing only a heartbeat earlier. I closed the distance quickly, moving low and fast, disarming the nearest soldier before he had time to adjust his aim, the weapon clattering uselessly to the floor as I pushed past him toward the others. I did not seek to cause lasting harm. That was never the goal. I simply needed to move, to create enough confusion and disruption that the path ahead remained open long enough for me to reach it. By the time I cleared the junction, all 4 soldiers were left disarmed and disoriented, none of them seriously hurt, but each of them now carrying a very different understanding of what humanity actually was, compared to the rumors they had grown up believing. The ship's alarm continued blaring overhead, joined now by Skarn's voice booming through the communication system, sharp with an anger that had not existed in his tone back in the throne room. "Find it," he commanded, the words echoing through every corridor of the ship. "I do not care how many doors it tears apart. I want it brought before me, now." I almost smiled at that. He still believed this was about capturing something that had escaped, rather than understanding that the entire foundation of his confidence had just begun to crumble beneath him. The corridors grew narrower as I climbed toward the upper decks, each new door presenting the same challenge as the last, and each one falling to the same relentless, focused pressure that had worked since the very first barrier I encountered. My hands burned with the effort, blood mixing with sweat across torn knuckles, but I did not stop, because stopping now meant accepting that this entire effort had been for nothing. I thought about Vale and Doss, still waiting in that cell far below, trusting a promise I intended to keep. I thought about the 11 banners hanging in the throne room, each one a story I intended to make sure was not repeated with humanity added to the list. A heavier security door stood between myself and the final corridor leading toward the bridge, thicker than anything I had encountered so far, clearly designed to protect the most critical section of the ship from exactly this kind of threat. I pressed my hands against the seam, found my grip, and pulled. This one resisted longer than the others, the reinforced frame fighting against every ounce of pressure I applied. I planted my feet more firmly, drawing on every reserve of strength I had left, refusing to let this final barrier stand between myself and what waited on the other side. Slowly, painfully, the metal began to bend, the seal cracking under pressure it had never once been designed to withstand. With a final, screaming groan of tortured metal, the door tore open. Beyond it stood the corridor leading directly to the bridge, and at the far end, framed by the harsh light spilling from the command deck, stood Skarn himself, no longer seated on his throne, no longer wearing the casual amusement that had filled his expression when we first met. His yellow eyes had narrowed into something closer to disbelief, watching as the creature he had dismissed as soft and harmless stood in the wreckage of his ship's most heavily reinforced security door, breathing hard, hands bleeding, and very clearly not finished yet. Behind him, Threll Ka stood frozen, the mocking confidence from earlier completely drained from his expression. Other officers crowded the bridge entrance, weapons raised but hesitant, none of them quite willing to be the first to test whether their training had prepared them for whatever this human truly was. I stepped through the wreckage of the door, into the corridor, closing the final distance toward the bridge with steady, unhurried steps. The alarm continued blaring around us, a sound that had once represented certainty and control, now reduced to nothing more than noise against the silence that had fallen over everyone watching me approach. Skarn's voice, when it finally came, carried none of the easy amusement from our first meeting. "How?" he said, the single word heavy with something I had not expected to hear from him. Genuine uncertainty. I did not answer immediately. I simply kept walking, closing the distance one measured step at a time, watching as every soldier between myself and the bridge slowly lowered their weapons, none of them willing to be the one who discovered exactly what would happen if they tried to stop me now. The bridge of the hollow maw stretched wide and open, banks of consoles lining the walls, each one staffed by crew members who had stopped working entirely the moment I stepped through the final doorway. The massive viewport at the front of the room showed the endless dark of space beyond, dotted with distant stars that had witnessed 11 worlds fall to this very ship, without a single moment of resistance like the one unfolding now. Skarn stood near his command throne, no longer seated, no longer relaxed. His clawed hands had curled into fists at his sides, and for the first time since I had been brought aboard this vessel, I saw something in his expression that had nothing to do with mockery or amusement. "You tore through 6 security doors," he said slowly, as if speaking the words aloud might help him understand them better. "Doors built to withstand boarding parties, built to withstand weapons fire. You tore through them with nothing but your hands." "You built them to stop soldiers," I said, keeping my voice steady despite the exhaustion settling into my arms. "You never built them to stop something that simply refuses to accept the word no." Threll Ka stepped forward slightly, his earlier confidence replaced by something closer to disbelief mixed with anger. "This is impossible. Your species surrendered to the Vayrans without a fight. Every report we received confirmed it." "You heard one story," I said, echoing the thought that had carried me through every corridor of this ship, "and you assumed it was the whole truth. Humanity didn't surrender to the Vayrans because we were weak. We retreated because that particular fight wasn't worth fighting yet. And we have learned, across our entire history, exactly when a battle is worth the cost, and when it isn't." Skarn's eyes narrowed further, and I could see him recalculating everything he thought he understood about the species standing in front of him. Then why come this far into our territory at all? Why risk capture if your people are so careful about which battles they choose? "My ship was a scout," I said. "We were mapping border space. the same as every other species does when expanding into unfamiliar territory. You found us first. That part wasn't planned. Everything that happened after, though, that part was entirely my choice. The silence that followed stretched long enough that I could hear the soft hum of the bridge consoles, the distant echo of alarms still sounding through other sections of the ship, slowly being called off as soldiers realized the threat they had been chasing was no longer running from anything. "What do you want?" Skarn finally asked, and there was something almost careful in the way he said it now, a tone I doubted he had used with anyone in a very long time. "2 prisoners," I said, "from the lower holding block, Vale and Doss. You let them go, along with myself, and along with every other prisoner currently held aboard this ship." A ripple of disbelief moved through the officers crowding the bridge entrance, several of them exchanging glances that suggested this request, more than anything else that had happened tonight, struck them as the strangest part of the entire encounter. Here stood a creature who had just torn through the most heavily reinforced sections of their ship, and rather than demanding power, rather than threatening destruction, it was simply asking for freedom on behalf of others who had no way to demand it themselves. Skarn studied me for a long moment, his expression shifting through something I could not fully read, somewhere between calculation and what might have been the beginning of genuine respect, however reluctant. "And if I refuse? Then I start on the next door," I said simply, "and the one after that, until this entire ship understands that the locks you depend on were never as strong as you believe them to be." He was quiet again, longer this time, his gaze drifting briefly toward the torn doorway behind me, toward the corridor lined with the wreckage of barriers that had failed against nothing more than determination and bare hands. I watched him weigh the cost of continued resistance against the simple math of what I had already proven capable of, and the math, it seemed, did not favor him. "Release the prisoners," Skarn finally said, his voice carrying toward the soldiers waiting near the bridge entrance, none of them moving until he repeated the order with sharper authority. "All of them. Bring them to the launch bay." Threl Ka looked as though he wanted to protest, but a single glance from Skarn silenced whatever objection had been forming. The soldiers moved quickly after that, eager, it seemed, to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the situation unfolding on the bridge. While we waited, Skarn studied me with an intensity that felt different from our first meeting, less mockery and more something closer to genuine curiosity, the kind a warlord develops only after discovering that his entire understanding of the galaxy required revision. "Your species will reach our territory eventually," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Properly, I mean. Not scouts drifting near a border. Fleets." "Eventually," I agreed. "And when that happens?" I considered the question carefully before answering. "That depends entirely on what kind of welcome we receive. Humanity doesn't go looking for fights we can avoid, but we have never once been the kind of species that backs down from one we cannot." Skarn said nothing further, though something in his posture had changed, a subtle shift that suggested the lesson learned tonight would not be easily forgotten, regardless of how the rest of this encounter unfolded. The journey to the launch bay passed in silence, soldiers giving me a wide berth as I walked alongside Skarn through corridors still scarred by torn doors and dented frames. When we arrived, Vale and Doss were already waiting, along with several other prisoners I had not yet met, each of them looking between myself and the warlord, with expressions caught somewhere between disbelief and cautious hope. Vale's eyes found mine immediately, and something in her expression eased the moment she understood what was happening. "You came back," she said softly. "I told you I would," I answered. A small transport ship sat ready in the launch bay, far smaller than the hollow maw, clearly meant to ferry prisoners and supplies between vessels rather than serve any combat purpose. Skarn gestured toward it with a tired motion, the gesture of someone who had spent the last several hours recalculating everything he believed about strength and weakness. "Take it," he said. "Leave my ship." I studied him for a long moment before stepping toward the transport, pausing just before boarding to look back at the warlord who had once stood so confidently certain of his own dominance. "You mocked something you never understood," I said. "That mistake belongs to you, not to me. Make sure the rest of your people learn from it, before humanity arrives in numbers large enough that lessons stop being optional." He did not respond, and I did not wait for one. I boarded the transport alongside Vale, Doss, and the other freed prisoners, watching through the small viewport as the launch bay doors opened, releasing us into open space, away from the hollow maw and everything it represented. The story of what happened aboard that ship spread quickly across the system Skarn's people controlled, growing with each retelling, though the core of it remained consistent no matter how many times the details shifted in the mouths of those who shared it. A human, alone, unarmed, had walked through 6 reinforced doors using nothing but bare hands, and refused to stop until every prisoner aboard a Warlord's Dreadnought walked free. It was not the story of an escape. It became something far more important than that, a single data point that forced an entire region of the galaxy to begin asking a question they had never seriously considered before that night. If one human, alone and unarmed, could do this much, what exactly would happen when humanity finally arrived in force, with fleets behind them, instead of a single scout ship drifting too close to a contested border? Months later, sitting in a debriefing room back among my own people, I was asked to describe exactly what had happened aboard the Hollow Maw, what had driven the decisions I made in those critical hours when everything could have gone very differently. A young officer named Claire Whitfield, newly assigned to intelligence analysis, leaned forward as I finished my account, her expression caught somewhere between fascination and disbelief. "You could have simply waited for rescue," she said. "Command would have sent a retrieval team eventually. Why take that risk yourself?" I thought about the question for a long moment before answering, remembering Vale's voice asking nearly the same thing aboard a ship I had no business escaping, remembering 11 banners hanging from a ceiling, built to celebrate conquests nobody had ever successfully resisted. "Because somebody needed to prove the story they were telling about us was wrong," I said. "And because waiting for someone else to fix a problem you are capable of fixing yourself has never really been something our species does well." Claire smiled slightly at that, jotting something down on her tablet before continuing with the rest of her questions. Outside the debriefing room's window, the lights of a human colony stretched toward the horizon, ordinary and unremarkable, the kind of quiet, stubborn permanence that had carried our species through every challenge it had ever faced, long before the stars had any reason to notice us at all. They were noticing now. And somewhere out among those distant systems, a warlord who had once mocked something he never understood was teaching his crew an entirely new lesson, one built not on the comfortable certainty of conquest, but on the uncomfortable, undeniable truth that strength sometimes arrives in forms too small to recognize until it has already torn every door from its hinges.